The Montana sky stretched endlessly above Jake Henderson as he stood at the edge of his grandfather's property, staring at the dilapidated red barn that had seen better decades. It was early September, and the morning air carried that peculiar crispness that signaled summer's reluctant surrender to autumn. The grass beneath his worn work boots was still wet with dew, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its lonely song across the rolling hills. Jake was 32 years old, but today he felt ancient. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible yoke, one he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. 3 months ago, his grandfather, William Henderson, had passed away at 87, leaving Jake the family farm, all 200 acres of it, along with a mountain of debt and equipment that should have been retired before Jake was born. The farm had been in the Henderson family for 4 generations, a fact that his grandfather never let anyone forget. But times had changed. Corporate farms had swallowed up most of the small operations in Park County, and the ones that remained were barely hanging on. Jake's father had abandoned farming 30 years ago, moving to Billings to work construction, a decision that had created a rift between father and son that never quite healed before William's death. Now Jake was back, having left his job as a mechanic in Bozeman to honor a deathbed promise he'd made to his grandfather. "Don't let them take the land, boy. Don't let everything we built turn into another strip mall or housing development." He walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel drive. The structure leaned slightly to the left, its red paint peeling in long strips that revealed weathered grey wood beneath. The doors hung crooked on rusty hinges, and several boards were missing from the sides, creating gaps that let in shafts of morning sunlight. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay, motor oil, and time. Dust motes danced in the light beams, and swallows had built nests in the rafters. Along one wall sat his grandfather's old Ford pickup, a 1987 model that hadn't run in 5 years. Garden tools hung on pegs, their handles worn smooth by decades of use. In the corner, covered by a tattered canvas tarp, sat the object of Jake's current attention. He pulled the tarp away, sending up a cloud of dust that made him cough. Beneath it sat a 1960 John Deere 3010 tractor, and calling it rough would have been generous. The green paint had faded to a sickly olive color, and rust covered nearly every surface. The tires were flat and cracked, the seat was torn with springs poking through, and the exhaust pipe had rusted through in several places. One headlight was completely missing, giving the machine a lopsided, defeated appearance. "Jesus!" Jake muttered, walking around the tractor. "Grandpa, what were you thinking?" He'd seen this tractor exactly twice in his life. Once when he was 8 years old, watching his grandfather drive it across the back 40, and once at age 16, when it was already parked in this corner, apparently retired from service. That meant it had been sitting here unmoved for at least 16 years, probably longer. Jake climbed up onto the tractor, the metal cold and rough beneath his hands. The seat groaned under his weight, and more rust flaked off onto his jeans. He tried the steering wheel. It moved, but with considerable resistance. The gear shift was locked in place, frozen by time and corrosion. The throttle felt like it was set in concrete. According to his grandfather's lawyer, there was enough money in the estate to cover about 6 months of property taxes and basic expenses, but nothing more. If Jake wanted to keep the farm, he needed to make it productive, and quickly. But all the modern equipment was either sold off years ago or broken beyond repair. The newer tractor, a 1995 Case IH that his grandfather had bought used, had a seized engine that would cost more to fix than to replace. That left rust, as Jake had already started calling the old John Deere in his mind. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Sarah, his girlfriend of 2 years, calling from Bozeman. "Hey," he answered, climbing down from the tractor. "How's it going out there?" Her voice sounded distant, not just physically but emotionally. They'd been having this conversation for 3 months now. "It's going," Jake said, walking out of the barn into the sunlight. "Still trying to figure out what's salvageable." "Jake, We need to talk about this. You've been out there for 3 months. You gave up your job, your apartment, our apartment. I don't even know when I'm going to see you again." He could hear the frustration in her voice, the same frustration that had been building since he'd made the decision to honor his grandfather's wishes. Sarah was a paralegal at a growing firm in Bozeman, with ambitions to go to law school. A failing farm in the middle of nowhere didn't fit into her 5-year plan. "I know, Sarah. I just need a little more time to—" "Time for what? To fix something that can't be fixed? Jake, your grandfather lived in the past. The world moved on, and he didn't. You don't have to make the same mistake." The words stung because there was truth in them. "He trusted me with this," Jake said quietly. "He left you with an impossible burden," Sarah countered. "There's a difference between honoring someone's memory and throwing your life away." They talked for another 10 minutes, the conversation circling through the same arguments they'd had a dozen times before. When they hung up, nothing was resolved, but the distance between them felt wider than the 150 miles separating Bozeman from the farm. Jake spent the rest of the morning taking inventory. The barn also housed an ancient Ford tractor that was missing its engine, a hay baler that was more rust than metal, and various implements for plowing and planting that all dated back to the Reagan administration. The main house, a 2-story farmhouse built in 1947, needed a new roof, new windows, and probably a complete renovation of the plumbing and electrical systems. By noon, he was sitting on the front porch of the house, eating a sandwich and staring out at the fields. The land itself was beautiful, rolling hills covered in grass that turned golden in the afternoon light, bordered by pine forests on 2 sides and a creek that ran along the southern boundary. On a clear day, you could see the crazy mountains in the distance, their peaks still holding snow even in September. This land had meant everything to his grandfather. William Henderson had worked it his entire adult life, raised 4 children here, buried his wife in the small family cemetery at the top of the hill. He'd survived droughts and recessions, seen neighbors lose everything, but somehow kept holding on, even as the farm became less and less viable economically. Jake understood now why his father had left. There was a nobility in the struggle, but there was also a trap. You could pour your whole life into something and still lose it all to forces beyond your control, weather, markets, age, time. But he'd made a promise, and Henderson men kept their promises. It was one of the few things his grandfather and father agreed on. That afternoon, Jake drove into town. Livingston, population 7,000, gateway to Yellowstone National Park, and home to artists, fly fishermen, and the last remnants of Montana's ranching culture. He needed supplies, but more importantly, he needed advice. Murray's Hardware had been on Main Street since 1952, and Murray himself, now in his 70s, still worked the counter most days. Jake found him in the back, organizing boxes of screws. "Jake Henderson," Murray said, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Heard you were back. Sorry about your grandfather. Bill was a good man." "Thanks, Murray. Yeah, I'm trying to sort through the mess he left behind." "A farm's in rough shape, I take it?" "That's putting it mildly. I've got a barn full of equipment that belongs in a museum, and not much else." Murray nodded knowingly. Bill never could bring himself to let go of anything. Kept thinking things would turn around, that the farm would bounce back like it did in the old days. They talked for a while about the state of the property, and Murray shared stories about Jake's grandfather. Some Jake had heard before, others new. When Jake mentioned the old John Deere, Murray's eyes lit up. The 3010, that was Bill's pride and joy back in the day. Bought it new in 1960 with money from his best wheat harvest. Worked that tractor for 30 years straight. "It's been sitting in the barn for at least 16 years, maybe longer. I don't think it's salvageable." Murray stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Those old Deeres were built to last. Might be worth taking a look at it. Simple engines, straightforward mechanics. Not like the computerized stuff they make now. Even if I could get it running, I'd need tires, probably a new battery, all the fluids changed. Murray, I don't have that kind of money. How much you got?" Jake did the math in his head. Maybe $500 I can spare, and that's pushing it." Murray thought for a moment, then disappeared into his office. He came back with a business card. "This is Tom Brennan. Runs a small engine repair shop out past the Shields River. Used to work on tractors before he semi-retired. Tell him I sent you. He might be able to help, or at least tell you if it's worth trying." Jake took the card. "Thanks, Murray. One more thing," Murray said, his expression serious. "Don't let anyone pressure you into selling that land. Developers have been circling Park County like vultures for years. That property's worth a lot more than you probably think, but not as much as what it means." As Jake drove back to the farm, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the highway, he thought about Murray's words. The easy thing would be to sell it all. The land, the equipment, everything. Take the money, go back to Bozeman, make peace with Sarah, start over. But every time he considered it, he heard his grandfather's voice. "Don't let them take the land, boy." That evening, Jake called Tom Brennan. The man had a gruff voice, but was friendly enough. They arranged for Tom to come out to the farm the next morning to look at the tractor. "Fair warning," Tom said before hanging up. "If it's been sitting as long as you say, it might not be worth the effort. But I'll take a look." Jake spent the rest of the evening cleaning out the barn, giving himself something to do besides worry. He found old photographs in a wooden box. His grandfather as a young man, standing proudly beside the brand-new John Deere. His grandmother Margaret, smiling in front of the house when it was freshly painted. His father as a boy, sitting on that same tractor, looking happy in a way Jake had never seen in his adult life. These people had believed in something. They'd built something. Whether it was practical or profitable didn't seem to matter as much as the simple fact that it was theirs, that it meant something. As darkness fell over the Montana hills, Jake sat on the porch one more time, listening to the crickets and watching the stars emerge in the vast sky. Tomorrow, Tom would come and probably confirm what Jake already suspected, that the tractor was beyond saving, that his grandfather's dream was finally, truly dead. But tonight, in the quiet of the farm, surrounded by the ghosts of 4 generations, Jake allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving here. Maybe Rust, as broken and forgotten as she was, still had one more season left in her. He would find out tomorrow. Tom Brennan's pickup truck rumbled up the gravel drive at 8 o'clock sharp, pulling a small trailer loaded with tools and equipment. The man who climbed out was in his late 60s, built like a fire plug, with arms that suggested a lifetime of physical work. He wore grease-stained coveralls and a John Deere cap that had seen better decades. "You must be Jake," Tom said, extending a calloused hand. "Knew your grandfather. Hell of a farmer in his day." "Thanks for coming out," Jake said, leading him toward the barn. "I appreciate you taking the time. Murray said you've got Bill's old 3010. Been a while since I've seen one of those." They entered the barn, and Tom stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. When he saw the tractor, he let out a low whistle. "Well, she's certainly seen better days," he said, walking slowly around the machine. He ran his hand along the fender and rust flaked off under his touch. "How long has she been sitting here?" "At least 16 years, possibly 20 or more." Tom nodded, pulling a flashlight from his pocket and beginning a more thorough examination. He checked the oil dipstick, looked at the fuel tank, examined the tires, studied the engine. Jake watched him work, unable to read the man's expression. After about 20 minutes, Tom stepped back and crossed his arms. "Well, I'll tell you what you've got here. You've got a tractor that's been neglected for a long time, but you don't have a lost cause. Not yet, anyway." Jake felt a small spark of hope. Really? These 3010s were tough as nails. This one's got a lot of problems, don't get me wrong, but nothing that can't be fixed if you're willing to put in the work. The question is whether you're ready for that kind of project. "What kind of work are we talking about?" Tom pulled a small notebook from his pocket and started making a list. "First, we need to see if the engine will even turn over. If it's seized, that's a different conversation. But assuming it's not, we'll need to drain all the old fluids, oil, coolant, fuel. The fuel system's probably gummed up completely, so we'll need to clean the tank, replace the lines, rebuild the carburetor. The battery's dead, obviously. Tires are shot, but that's expensive. Might be able to patch them temporarily just to get her mobile. Brakes will need work. Electrical system needs checking. That's just for starters. Jake felt his hope deflating. How much are we talking about in parts? Depends on how much you want to do yourself versus how much you want to pay someone else to do. If you do all the labor yourself, and we get creative with sourcing parts, maybe $1,500 to $2,000. Could be more if we run into surprises, and we always run into surprises. I don't have that kind of money, Jake admitted. I've got maybe $500 I can spare. Tom was quiet for a moment, thinking. Tell you what, I've got some used parts sitting around my shop, filters, hoses, things like that. Probably enough to get started. We can tackle this in stages, see how far we get. I'll charge you for parts at cost, and we'll work out the labor as we go. Why would you do that? Tom looked at him directly. Because your grandfather once helped me when I needed it, and because I'm old enough to remember when neighbors helped neighbors. Also, frankly, because I'm bored as hell in retirement, and this beats watching daytime television. Jake felt a lump forming in his throat. I don't know what to say. Say you're willing to get your hands dirty. This isn't going to be easy, and there's no guarantee we'll even get her running. But if you're serious about keeping this farm going, you're going to need to learn how things work around here. Consider this your education. They shook hands, and Tom said he'd be back the next day with tools and some initial parts. As his truck disappeared down the drive, Jake stood in the barn, looking at Rust with new eyes. This wasn't just about fixing a tractor anymore. It was about learning, about connecting with something his grandfather had valued, about proving to himself that he was capable of more than he thought. That afternoon, Jake called Sarah again. He told her about Tom, about the possibility of fixing the tractor, about what it might mean for the farm. Jake, that's great, she said, but her voice lacked enthusiasm. But fixing one old tractor doesn't solve the bigger problems. You still need money for property taxes, for the house repairs, for everything else. What's your plan for actually making the farm profitable? I'm working on that, Jake said, though he wasn't, not really. He'd been so focused on immediate problems that he hadn't thought much about the long-term strategy. I'm not trying to be negative, Sarah continued. I just worry that you're investing all this time and energy into something that can't work. And I worry about us, about what this means for our future. I know, Jake said softly. Just give me a little more time, please. After they hung up, Jake spent the evening researching. He looked up information about small farm operations, organic farming, direct-to-consumer sales. He read about farmers' markets, community-supported agriculture, agritourism. The more he read, the more he realized how much he didn't know, but also how many possibilities existed for someone willing to think differently. The next morning, Tom arrived with his truck bed full of supplies. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The first task was seeing if the engine would turn over manually. We're going to remove the spark plugs and try to rotate the engine by hand, Tom explained. If it's seized, we'll know right away. They removed the plugs, and Tom produced a large wrench that fit the crankshaft bolt. Go ahead, he said to Jake. Give it a try. Jake applied pressure to the wrench. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, with a grinding sound that made him wince, the engine began to move. That's good, Tom said. Means the pistons aren't frozen in the cylinders. Keep going. Work it back and forth. They spent the next hour manually rotating the engine, working penetrating oil into the cylinders, slowly freeing up parts that had sat motionless for years. It was hot, dirty work, and Jake's arms ached, but there was something satisfying about it. The physical labor, the tangible progress. Your grandfather ever teach you about engines? Tom asked as they worked. Not really. He died when I was in high school, and before that my dad kept us away from the farm as much as possible. I think he didn't want me to fall in love with it the way he had. Did it work? Jake paused, thinking. I don't know. I loved visiting here when I was a kid. The space, the freedom, the way everything felt real in a way that city life didn't. But I also saw how hard my grandfather worked, how little he had to show for it at the end. I can understand why my dad left. And yet here you are. Yeah, Jake said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Here I am. Over the next week, they fell into a routine. Tom would arrive mid-morning, and they'd work until mid-afternoon. They drained the old sludge-like oil from the engine and replaced it with fresh oil. They cleaned out the fuel tank, which was full of rust and old gasoline that had turned to varnish. They rebuilt the carburetor, replacing gaskets and cleaning tiny passages with wire and solvent. Tom proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and thorough. He didn't just tell Jake what to do. He explained why they were doing it, how the systems worked, what could go wrong and how to fix it. Jake found himself fascinated by the mechanical logic of it all, the way each part connected to create something functional and purposeful. These old tractors are simple compared to modern ones, Tom explained one afternoon as they worked on the electrical system. No computers, no sensors, just basic mechanics and electricity. That's actually an advantage for small operations. You can fix most problems yourself with basic tools and some knowledge. They discovered the generator was shot, but Tom had an old one in his shop that would work with some modification. The starter motor was seized, but they managed to free it up with patient work and penetrating oil. The ignition system needed new wiring, which they carefully installed, following the original routing. During their lunch breaks, sitting on overturned buckets in the barn, Tom told stories about the old days, about when there were dozens of small farms in the valley, when neighbors helped each other with harvests, when the county fair was the social event of the year. Your grandfather was part of all that, Tom said. He saw it disappear, farm by farm, family by family. Broke his heart, but he kept going. Stubborn old bastard. Why did it all disappear? Jake asked. Was it just economics? Partly. Corporate farming, globalization, cheap imports, all that played a role. But it was also a change in values, I think. People stopped wanting to do the hard work, stopped believing in the long-term value of holding onto land and building something that would last beyond their own lifetime. Can't entirely blame them. It's a hard life, and the rewards aren't always clear. Do you think it's possible to make it work now? A small farm like this? Tom considered the question carefully. I think it depends on what you mean by make it work. If you mean get rich, probably not. But if you mean support yourself, produce something of value, live a meaningful life, yeah, I think it's possible. But you have to be smart about it, and you have to be willing to do things differently than they were done before. As the second week began, they were finally ready to try starting the engine. They'd done everything they could without actually running it. New fluids, rebuilt fuel system, repaired electrical components, new spark plugs. Tom had brought a battery from his shop and they connected it to the tractor. Moment of truth, Tom said, standing by the engine with a fire extinguisher handy, just in case. Give it a try. Jake climbed into the seat, his heart pounding. He turned the key and the starter motor groaned. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times, but didn't catch. Give it more choke, Tom called out. Jake adjusted the choke and tried again. This time, the engine coughed, sputtered, and for one beautiful moment actually fired. Then it died. We're close, Tom said, grinning. Try it again. Jake tried repeatedly over the next 15 minutes, and each time the engine would fire for a moment before dying. Tom made small adjustments to the carburetor, checked the timing, examined the fuel flow. One more time, he said finally, and when she catches, ease off the choke slowly. Jake turned the key. The engine turned over, coughed, and then suddenly roared to life. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The whole tractor shook violently, but the engine was running. Jake couldn't believe it. He looked at Tom, who was laughing and giving him a thumbs up. "Keep her running," Tom shouted over the noise. "Let her warm up." Jake sat there, hands on the vibrating steering wheel, listening to the rough, uneven idle of the ancient engine. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't smooth, but it was running. Rust, the tractor he'd thought was beyond saving, was alive. They let it run for about 10 minutes, watching carefully for any problems, leaks, smoke, unusual noises. The idle smoothed out somewhat as the engine warmed up and the black smoke gradually decreased. Finally, Tom signaled for Jake to shut it down. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom said, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's got life in her yet." Jake climbed down from the tractor, his legs shaky with excitement and relief. "I can't believe we actually did it." "This is just the beginning," Tom reminded him. "She's running, but she's not roadworthy yet. Still need tires, brakes need work, hydraulics need testing, and she's going to need a lot of fine-tuning. But this is the hard part done. The rest is just time and patience." That evening after Tom had left, Jake called Sarah. For the first time in weeks, he had genuinely good news to share. "That's great, Jake," she said, and this time she sounded like she meant it. "I'm proud of you. There's still a lot of work to do, but Tom thinks we can actually get her field ready. And I've been thinking about ways to make the farm productive. I want to talk to you about some ideas." They talked for over an hour, the longest conversation they'd had in weeks. Jake shared his research about farmers' markets, about growing specialty crops, about the growing demand for local organic produce. Sarah, with her analytical mind, asked good questions and helped him think through the challenges. "It's risky," she said honestly, "but at least you're thinking beyond just keeping the farm from falling apart. That's progress." After they hung up, Jake walked out to the barn one more time. In the darkness, Rust was just a shape, but Jake could picture her now as she'd been that morning, shaking, smoking, loud, but alive. He'd brought something back from the dead, something his grandfather had valued. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. Tomorrow they'd work on the tires, then the brakes, then the hydraulics. One step at a time, one problem at a time, they'd make her whole again. And maybe, in the process, Jake was becoming whole too. The Livingston Farmers Market occupied a parking lot behind the old railway depot every Saturday morning from May through October. Jake had driven past it 100 times growing up, but had never really paid attention to what happened there. Now, on a crisp Saturday morning in late September, he walked through the rows of vendors with new eyes. There were perhaps 20 stalls set up, selling everything from fresh vegetables and eggs to handmade crafts and baked goods. The crowd was a mix of locals and tourists, and despite the early hour, there was a lively, almost festive atmosphere. Jake approached a vegetable stand run by a woman about his age, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her table displayed an impressive array of produce, tomatoes in various colors, peppers, squash, bundles of kale and chard, all arranged with obvious care. "Help you with something?" she asked, looking up from bagging vegetables for a customer. "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about how this works," Jake said. "I'm thinking about becoming a vendor next season." She finished with her customer before turning her full attention to Jake. "You're farming around here?" "Trying to. I inherited my grandfather's place out past Shields River, 200 acres, mostly unused." "Bill Henderson's place?" she asked, her expression shifting to recognition. "I heard he passed. I'm sorry." "You knew him?" "Not well, but he used to come to the market sometimes, years ago, before everything got too hard for him, I think." She extended her hand. "I'm Elena Rodriguez. My family has a farm about 10 miles from here." They talked for a while between her interactions with customers, and Elena proved to be a wealth of information. She explained the market's rules. Vendors had to grow or produce what they sold. There was an application process, and spots were limited. She talked about what sold well, what didn't, the importance of presentation and customer relationships. "The key is finding your niche," she said. "There are already several vegetable vendors, so you need something that sets you apart. Specialty crops, organic certification, heirloom varieties, something that gives people a reason to buy from you instead of someone else. What's your niche? Jake asked. We focus on peppers and tomatoes, particularly heirloom varieties that you can't get in grocery stores. My grandfather brought seeds from Mexico when he came here 40 years ago, and we've been growing them ever since. People know us for flavors they can't get anywhere else. Jake absorbed this information, his mind already working on possibilities. How long did it take you to become profitable? Elena laughed. Profitable is a strong word. We make enough to keep going, to justify the work. But we're not getting rich. My husband works at the hospital, and that's really what keeps us afloat. The farm is more like a very demanding part-time job that barely pays minimum wage when you factor in all the hours. It was an honest answer, and Jake appreciated it. That's kind of what I figured. Why are you doing this? Eleanor asked directly. If you inherited the land, you could sell it for a lot of money. Why put yourself through the struggle of trying to make farming work? Jake thought about the question, one he'd been asking himself for months. Because my grandfather asked me to keep it going, and because I think there's value in what he was trying to preserve, even if I'm not entirely sure what that is yet. Elena nodded slowly. That's a better answer than most people give. A lot of folks get into this with romantic ideas about farm life, and they burn out within a year. But if you're doing it for something bigger than yourself, you might actually have a chance. She gave Jake her phone number and told him to call if he had questions. As he walked away, he felt both encouraged and daunted. This was going to be even harder than he'd thought, but at least now he had a sense of what was possible. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake and Tom continued working on Rust. They'd managed to source used tires that were serviceable if not pretty, and they spent 2 full days replacing them. Back-breaking work that left Jake's muscles screaming. The brake system required complete rebuilding, and the hydraulics needed new seals and hoses. This tractor's costing you more than you thought, isn't she? Tom observed one afternoon as they bled the brake system. Yeah, Jake admitted. I'm basically out of money. I've been putting some things on credit that I probably shouldn't. What about selling some of the land? Not all of it, just a parcel or two to give yourself some working capital. Jake had considered this, but it felt like a betrayal of his grandfather's wishes. I don't know. That feels like the beginning of the end, you know. Sell a little now, a little more later until there's nothing left. Maybe, Tom said. Or maybe it's practical thinking. Sometimes you have to give up a little to save the rest. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a truck Jake didn't recognize. A man in his 50s climbed out, wearing expensive jeans and a polo shirt that looked out of place on a farm. "Jake Henderson," the man called out. "That's me," Jake said, standing and wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm Richard Moss with Bridger Development Corporation. I was hoping to talk to you about your property." Jake had been expecting this. Murray had warned him that developers would come calling eventually. "I'm not interested in selling." "I understand," Moss said smoothly. "But at least hear me out. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for this property. We're talking about enough money that you'd never have to work again if you didn't want to." I said, "I'm not interested." Moss smiled, unfazed. "Mr. Henderson, can I be frank with you? This farm is dying. It's been dying for decades. Your grandfather held on through sheer stubbornness, but the economic reality is that operations this size can't compete anymore. You're young, you have your whole life ahead of you. Why chain yourself to a losing proposition when you could walk away with enough money to do anything you want?" "Because it's not just about money," Jake said, feeling his anger rising. "This land means something." "To who?" Moss challenged. "Your grandfather's gone. Your father abandoned it years ago. Who are you preserving this for?" Tom stepped forward. "I think it's time for you to leave." Moss held up his hands. "I'm just trying to help. Look, I'll leave my card. When you're ready to have a serious conversation about your future, give me a call. The offer won't be on the table forever." After he left, Tom and Jake stood in silence for a moment. That's going to happen a lot, Tom said finally. Developers see this land and see dollar signs. Prime location, good access, views of the mountains. They'd love to put in a subdivision or a resort. Over my dead body, Jake muttered. Just remember, there's no shame in selling if that's what you need to do. Don't let stubbornness or pride make you miserable. But Jake wasn't ready to consider that option. Not yet. That weekend, Jake attended a meeting of the Park County Small Farmers Association, a group Elena had told him about. About 15 people gathered in the basement of the public library, ranging in age from early 20s to late 70s. They discussed challenges, water rights, deer damage, market saturation, the difficulty of finding reliable help. But they also shared successes and strategies, and there was a sense of camaraderie that Jake found appealing. After the meeting, several people introduced themselves. There was Frank Cooper, an older man who raised grass-fed beef, Amy Chen, who ran a community-supported agriculture program with her wife, Marcus Brown, who was trying to establish an organic herb business. Each of them had a story similar to Jake's in some way, trying to make something work against long odds, motivated by something more than just profit. "How's Bill's old place doing?" Frank asked. "Haven't been out that way in years." "Rough," Jake admitted. "I'm trying to get it back in shape, but it's slow going." "What are you planning to grow?" "Still figuring that out. I'm open to suggestions." Frank thought for a moment. "You know what this area could use? A good berry operation. Strawberries, raspberries, maybe some unusual varieties. There's not much of that around here, and they sell well at the markets. They're labor-intensive, though." Others chimed in with their own suggestions. Specialty garlic, cut flowers, pastured poultry. The conversation continued over coffee at a nearby diner, and by the end of the evening, Jake had several pages of notes and a half-dozen new contacts. As he drove home under a sky full of stars, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in months. Genuine optimism. He wasn't alone in this. There was a community of people trying to do similar things, and they were willing to help each other. The next month passed in a blur of activity. With Tom's help, Jake finally got Rust fully operational. They'd rebuilt nearly every system, and while she wasn't pretty, she ran reliably. Tom showed Jake how to operate her safely, how to attach implements, how to perform basic maintenance. "She's not going to win any beauty contests," Tom said on the day they finished, "but she'll do honest work. That's what matters." Jake spent an entire day just driving the tractor around the property, getting a feel for her quirks and capabilities. There was something deeply satisfying about operating the machine, about the connection between intention and action, between the movement of his hands on the controls and the tractor's response. He understood now why his grandfather had loved this particular machine. He began preparing one of the fields for spring planting, working the soil that hadn't been worked in years. It was hard, slow work, and Rust protested loudly at times, but gradually the field began to look like a field again rather than an overgrown pasture. Sarah came out to visit one weekend, her first trip to the farm since Jake had moved back. She was quiet as he showed her around, and he couldn't read her expression. "So this is what you've been doing," she said finally, standing in the middle of the partially cleared field. "Yeah. What do you think?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I think you've worked really hard. I think you've accomplished something impressive. I also think," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I think our lives are going in different directions." Jake's heart sank. He'd known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "I love you," Sarah continued, "but I can't see myself here living this life. I want a career, graduate school, a life in the city. And you want this. We both deserve to pursue what we want, but I don't think we can do it together." They talked for a long time, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse as the afternoon light faded. There were tears, but there was also understanding. They weren't angry with each other, just honest about the fact that they wanted different things. After she left, Jake sat alone as darkness fell. He felt the loss acutely. Sarah had been part of his life for 2 years, and he'd imagined a future with her. But he also felt a strange sense of clarity. He'd made his choice, and while it had costs, it was his choice to make. That night, he walked out to the barn and looked at Rust in the moonlight. The tractor sat there, solid and real, a testament to what was possible when you refused to give up. His grandfather had worked this land for 6 decades, had poured his life into it, had believed it was worth preserving. Jake was starting to understand why. The land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was connection to the past, to the place, to a way of life that valued patience and persistence over quick profits. It was the potential for growth, both of crops and of character. It was the satisfaction of hard work producing tangible results. He didn't know yet if he could make it work economically. The challenges were real and the odds weren't great. But he knew now that he was going to try, truly try, not because of a deathbed promise, but because it was what he wanted. Tom had called it his education, and he'd been right. Jake was learning about tractors and soil and crops, but he was also learning about himself, about what mattered to him, about who he wanted to be. Winter was coming, and with it would come a long season of planning and preparation. Spring would bring the real test, planting, growing, harvesting, trying to turn potential into reality. But for now, standing in the moonlight with Rust beside him and the Montana sky stretching endlessly above, Jake Henderson felt ready for whatever came next. Winter in Montana arrived with the subtle force that locals recognized but outsiders often missed. A gradual shift in the quality of light, the angle of shadows, the behavior of animals preparing for the long season ahead. By November, Livingston was experiencing regular frosts, and by December, the snow had begun in earnest. Jake spent those months in a state of controlled hibernation, using the downtime to plan, learn, and prepare. The farmhouse became his classroom, the kitchen table covered with notebooks, seed catalogues, agricultural extension pamphlets, and scribbled calculations. He attended every workshop the county extension office offered: soil testing, crop rotation, integrated pest management, business planning for small farms. Tom became a regular fixture at the farm, stopping by twice a week ostensibly to check on Rust, but really, Jake suspected, because he enjoyed the company and the sense of purpose. They spent hours in the barn workshop, maintaining the tractor, repairing tools, building cold frames for early season planting. Tom taught Jake to weld, to sharpen blades, to troubleshoot hydraulic systems. Each skill was another tool in Jake's expanding repertoire. "Your grandfather would have liked this," Tom said one afternoon in January, as they rebuilt a plow that had sat unused for 15 years. "He always believed in self-sufficiency, in knowing how to fix things yourself. I wish I'd paid more attention when I was younger," Jake said. "There's so much he could have taught me. You're learning now. That's what matters." Jake had taken Frank Cooper's advice about berries seriously. After extensive research, he'd decided to focus on strawberries and raspberries for his first commercial crop, with plans to add more variety in subsequent years. The initial investment was significant: plants, irrigation equipment, row covers. But several members of the Farmers Association had offered to sell him materials at cost, and Eleanor had connected him with a grant program for beginning farmers that covered some of the expenses. In February, he attended a 3-day intensive workshop on berry cultivation, run by the State Agricultural College. There he met other farmers attempting similar ventures and began to understand the full scope of what he was undertaking. Berry farming was labor-intensive, timing-critical, and highly dependent on weather conditions. But the market was strong, and if he could produce quality fruit, there was definitely demand. He also made a decision that winter that surprised everyone, including himself. He got a part-time job. Through one of the Farmers Association members, he found work 3 days a week at a specialized equipment repair shop in Livingston. The pay wasn't great, but it brought in steady income, let him continue learning about machinery, and still left him time to work on the farm. "You're learning to be practical," Tom observed approvingly. "That's a good sign." His father called in March, their first conversation in months. The relationship had been strained since Jake's decision to move back to the farm, and Jake had been avoiding his calls. "How's it going out there?" his father asked, his tone carefully neutral. "It's going," Jake said, "getting ready for spring planting." "Jake, I've been thinking. Maybe we should talk about, if you're going to suggest I sell the place, save your breath." His father sighed. "I was going to say maybe we should talk about my relationship with your grandfather. About why I left, why I kept you away. You deserve to understand." They talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation Jake could remember having with his father. His father spoke honestly about the pressure of growing up on the farm, the expectations, the feeling that his entire life had been predetermined. He talked about watching his father work himself to exhaustion year after year, about the fear that he'd end up the same way, trapped by land and debt and tradition. "I don't regret leaving," his father said, "but I regret how I handled it, the distance I created, and I regret that you didn't get to know your grandfather the way you should have." "I'm getting to know him now," Jake said, "through the farm, through the people who knew him, through trying to finish what he started." "Just don't let it consume you the way it consumed him," his father warned. "Don't sacrifice everything else in your life for a piece of land." After they hung up, Jake sat with those words for a long time. There was wisdom in them, but also fear. Fear that had driven his father away and kept him away. Jake understood it, but he also understood that he had to find his own path, make his own mistakes, discover his own limits. As spring approached, Jake worked with renewed energy. In late March, once the danger of hard frost had mostly passed, he began preparing the berry field in earnest. With Rust pulling the plough, he worked the soil, removing rocks, mixing in compost and amendments based on his soil test results. It was grueling work, dawn to dusk, and there were days when his entire body ached, but there was also a satisfaction in the physical labor, in seeing tangible progress. Eleanor stopped by several times, offering advice and encouragement. She helped him set up his irrigation system, showed him techniques for mulching and weed control, shared her hard-earned knowledge about dealing with birds and other pests. "You're doing good work," she said one afternoon as they walked the prepared field. "This is going to be impressive if you can pull it off." "Big if," Jake said. "All farming is a big if. Weather, markets, pests, disease. There are a million things that can go wrong. But that's also what makes it meaningful. You're betting on yourself, on your ability to work with nature rather than against it. Not many people have the courage for that."